What's up guys, Dr. Seth, and we are back with another edition of Don't Be a Nerd. And today we are getting spinal because back stuff, low back stuff specifically, is a topic where people will listen to one podcast, they'll read one research paper, and then they'll fall into either a camp where they never want to move their spine again, or a camp where they think they can move their back all willy-nilly like a psychopath, and they end up missing out just because they aren't seeing the big picture. And as always, the truth falls somewhere in the middle, so let's get into it. And I bet you guys didn't think that I'd be starting out with a slide that says that, because I am someone who would fall into a movement optimism camp, meaning that I don't believe that there are any movements that are inherently bad. I believe that there is bad levels of preparedness, bad load selection, and bad range of motion selection that can lead us to feeling bad if we push a movement harder than we were prepared to do. And when it comes to spinal flexion specifically, we need to acknowledge that it has been demonstrated over and over again in the literature that as the degree of flexion increases, so does injury risk. As the degree of loading with spinal flexion increases, so does injury risk. But that does not mean it is as plain and simple as all flexion is bad, all loading and flexion is bad. It's a matter of asking, are we prepared to access the flexion that we are accessing? Are we prepared to load the flexion that we are loading? If we are prepared to access it, if we have control over the range of motion, accessing flexion will not be very risky. If we have a strong back, if we have control over our back with load and flexion, accessing flexion with load will not be very risky. It comes down to an equation of preparedness for the task versus the task at hand, just like any other injury mechanism. If we are trained, if we are prepared, if we are ready to handle what we're asking our body to do, our body will be able to handle it. And the big problem that I see with spinal flexion is that very, very few people are actually prepared to handle it because they don't train in flexion, because they have been told their whole lifting career that they need to stay neutral. And the big problem with neutral is that most people don't even understand what neutral means. And when we're thinking about the spine, the first thing we need to understand is that the spine has three curvatures. The cervical spine is lordotic, meaning that the curvature pushes forward. The thoracic spine is kyphotic, meaning that the curvature pushes backwards. The lumbar spine is again lordotic, meaning that the curvature pushes forward. So when we're considering neutral, we are talking about the range of motion within those curvatures that allows those passive structures, so like the ligaments of the spine, to exist without any active stress. Meaning that when we're chilling out in neutral, those ligaments aren't being stretched or pulled on one way or another. They're just sitting there with a little bit of slack, happy-dappy, hanging out, chilling out. So neutral doesn't mean a straight back. It doesn't mean a flat back. It means that we are hanging out in those curvatures in the position in the range of motion where the tissues that are non-contractile are not being stretched or pulled on. And the problem with that is when we look at the research and see what range of motion neutral actually is, we realize that there's only 1 to 2 degrees of neutral available between each spinal segment. When we look at the lumbar spine as a whole, there's only 5 degrees of neutral available, so the range of motion that truly is neutral is very, very, very small. And then comes the question, is it even realistic to try to maintain neutral as a powerlifter or in life in general? And the short, sweet answer is no. And there was a really neat study in 2019 that looked at high-level powerlifters in the start position of their deadlift and compared that position to where they were just standing relaxed. And what that study showed is that in the deadlift start position, those lifters displayed 25 degrees plus or minus 11 more lumbar flexion than they did standing up. So for those lifters who were advanced, who knew how to brace, who knew how to lift, they were accessing lumbar flexion at their deadlift start position. They were unable to avoid lumbar flexion in their deadlift start position. And I know a lot of you are probably watching this and going, hey Seth, but when I deadlift, my back looks flat. But here's the thing, if we remember that the lumbar spine is lordotic in its neutral position, deviation away from that lordotic curve, so flattening out the lumbar spine, is accessing flexion. The low back does not have to be rounded for it to be flexed relative to its neutral. So if we can't avoid flexion, how do we reduce the risks associated with flexion? And the big thing again, it comes down to our level of preparedness compared to the task at hand. And we're going to do that by training our torso musculature to control the spine and to move the spine. We're going to be training our spine to actually be able to move and be able to handle movement without exploding. And when we're starting out, we want to find a starting point that we can actually handle safely, especially if we are someone who lacks control, or we are someone who's in pain, or we are someone who is jacked up. Because if we start out going crazy and doing, 400-pound J curls with someone who has a history of lumbar injury, with someone who hasn't rehabbed properly, that probably isn't going to go very, very well. So when I'm starting people out with a rehab plan for the low back, or when I'm starting people out with a plan to demonstrate control of their low back, I will almost always start them out with exercises that will allow them to start to display control isometrically in close to a neutral position. So things like bracing drills, like dead bugs, things like the McGill Big Three, things like planks, they are absolutely fantastic to start us out with displaying control of our torso in neutral. We'll want to expand that out a little bit to find ways to contract harder. So I like to make planks active, meaning that I want to pull against each other. I want to progress bird dogs and dead bugs to bird dogs and dead bugs with loading of some sort. And you're like, how do I load a bird dog? Well, easiest way is going to be to realize that a bird dog is just a open chain single leg RDL. So we just do a single leg RDL, and that's a way to load a bird dog. As long as we're still braced in the hip, it's still the same hip extension with that torso rotation demand. So that is why single leg RDLs are friggin' sick. And once we have develop good control of the torso in neutral, once we have developed control of the torso with the limbs moving, we can start to progress towards actually moving that torso. And when we're introducing this, we want to do it with minimal loading, again, so we don't exceed the capacity, so we don't exceed preparedness. And when we are progressing into moving the torso, we never want to move as far as we can. We want to move as far as we feel safe and move as far as we can tolerate. Because if we're moving as far as we feel safe and we're moving as far as we can tolerate, we're going to allow us to stay in that safe zone. And the goal should never be to maximally flex your spine. The goal should be to be able to control spinal flexion in the ranges that you need to. So we're definitely not forcing range here. We're definitely not putting ourselves into a vulnerable position. We're just trying to get better at accessing the positions we can access, and over time, gradually expanding them. And the things I like for this are going to be active cat-cows, where we're going to be actively using our abs to pull into flexion that we can tolerate, but actively using our erectors to push into extension, and we can just rock back and forth, flexing abs, flexing erectors to ease into flexion and ease into extension. To learn to pull into flexion, a variation that I love is standing abs, where we're going to be doing a abdominal crunch, standing up next to a lat tower, rope around our neck. We're going to be flexing the abs and then pulling into controlled flexion, letting ourselves come up. These are sweet because we have like weight pulling us up, so our body weight's going to be reduced. It can basically teach us to learn how to bend over in a controlled manner. Once we're okay with that, I like to introduce some degree of loaded flexion where we're actually bending over. That could be something like a 45-degree back raise. That could be something like a J curl. And again, with both of those, the goal isn't to go as far as we can. The goal is to go as far as we feel safe, as far as we can control, and then expand from there. And once we can introduce flexion and tolerate it with minimal loading, we can start to gradually try to strengthen it. And again, this isn't a process that we want to rush. We want to make sure that we're increasing loading at a tolerable rate, and we want to make sure that we're not making things feel sketchy and we're not making things feel vulnerable as we go. We want to slowly introduce load, slowly progress, slowly build things up so that we can keep our backs happy as they get stronger. And the stronger the back is, the happier it should be. And I love to start people out with things like reverse hypers, things like back raises, things like seated good mornings with a cable. And note that I said cable, not a bar on your back, because with a cable pulling us forward rather than a bar pushing us down, there's going to be less shear. It's going to be a lot easier movement to introduce and build tolerance. Over time, of course, we can move towards gnarlier things like a real seated good morning, a round back stiff leg deadlift, or a loaded J curl. And the big thing to remember, when we're trying to increase preparedness at the low back, if it's getting worse, we're probably pushing too hard and we need to scale back a little bit. If it's staying the same and not getting better, not getting worse, we might need to try a little bit harder. So when it comes to spinal flexion, We don't need to be afraid of it, we don't need to be worried about it, we don't need to avoid it, but we also need to understand that there are going to be risks associated with it. And the best way to manage those risks is going to be to increase our preparedness so we can handle flexion if we ever find ourselves there. And once again, thank you so much for watching this, guys. Appreciate the heck out of you. And if you made it this far, please do me a favor and share this with your friends so we can keep this channel growing. Peace out.